there are a number of different ways we can forecast our external HR supply or external labor supply. So what should we be paying attention to? Well, first of all, we need to look at what we call net migration in and out of an area. So if we know people are leaving a region or a state or a local area because of economic conditions or any kind of other issues involved, then we need to know whether or not there is going to be an influx of people or there's going to be people exiting. And in the state of Illinois, for a long period of time, we've had problems with people net migrating out of Illinois to other states, in part because people are concerned about tax levels and gas prices and things like that. Except that when you recognize that the grass is not always greener on the other side. There might be high levels of this, but there's low services in other areas because the tax rate is lower, et cetera, et cetera. So what you find is that people are actually returning to Illinois now and recognizing that there's a lot of benefits to living in Illinois, even if the taxes are high and the gas prices are high, that there are still advantages to living here. And, it may not be an advantage for everybody, but that also does influence the flow in and out. You look at what happened with Trek bicycles. They had low unemployment, and so they needed to figure out how to get people to work to the area, to move to the area, to work there. And so they were instituting a way to get that net migration into the area of skilled labor. Obviously, we need to look at whether or not people are retiring. Do we have an area where the workforce is relatively old? Says somebody who's 62 herself. Obviously, I've got to be careful of that because, there are people my age and older who might still want to be working, and other people who are even younger than me. I've known people as young as 50 or 55 who've made decisions to retire early and to exit the workforce permanently. So we need to know what's going on with the retirement rate in our area and in our industry and with people in the skill set that we need. Now, you all wouldn't remember this, but during the mortgage crisis in 2008 and 2009, 6, 7, 8, 9 in that arena, a lot of people lost money in the crash of the economy, and so they were less likely to want to leave the workforce because their retirement plan got decimated by the crash in the crash in the economy and the mortgage crisis. So these are also factors that you should consider about whether or not you think someone will actually leave the workforce and retire permanently, or whether or not they're going to stay on board. We need to look at the graduation rates of people, and do we find that there's increasing number of graduates in local colleges and areas where that would create a surplus of employees available, or do we find that those numbers are shrinking, in which case then we would have a deficit of potential new employees. We've got to look at economic forecasts and technological development. Is technology going to decrease the demand for employees, or is it going to increase the demand for skills in a particular area? Like automation was a big thing in the 70s and 80s when we started automating processes that used to be done by hand. And so we needed less people, but what we did need is people that were skilled in running the automation. And then what that did is it created other jobs. And so people had to, learn new skills and transfer their skills to different jobs. So what you're going to see are shifts, right? So we need less people to do hands-on manual work, but we need more people who are skilled in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence and computer-aided drafting and CNC machines to produce products and services, right? Electronic print, the printers, right? That can print objects, right? So if you have the ability to print objects, you've got to learn that skill. You've got to learn the technology, the computer skills behind it. Some of the challenges, of course, are that there are people that don't want to learn the new skills. They like their way of doing things, and they don't want to ever change it, and they don't feel like there's any reason for them to change. And they figure like they can dig in and nothing will change for them. But that's not a good approach to things, because when an organization finds that there are people that are like, yeah, I'm not going to learn that, oftentimes they have to exit the door, because if you're not willing to learn the new skills and to learn new ways of doing things, they will find somebody to replace you. So we want to be paying attention to that. Looking at what our competitors are doing and whether or not they are hiring people or laying people off. What's going on with government regulations, right? We've got tariffs right now. And President Trump's reason for the tariffs is he wants to bring a lot of manufacturing business back to the United States and not do it abroad, which sounds really good, except that it takes a long time to build manufacturing environments and being willing to invest, because it's a huge capital investment to build manufacturing environments. And so when we find that some government regulations and pressures and policies are engaged in a certain behavior, there are pros and cons to that, right? So be mindful of what the downstream impact is going to be. So yes, you might say, oh, tariffs are a great idea. People will buy American. But if we don't have an infrastructure set up to manufacture those products, it's just still in the short and even in the intermediate term, it's going to cost people way more money. There aren't a lot of employers right now that are willing to invest money based on the tariff situation to invest in local manufacturing, simply because everything is very volatile, and the predictions on the market are kind of volatile. So we have to stay on top of that. We have to be listening to what's going on economically and make those decisions. Then there's all sorts of things that can affect our forecasting, our external supply of forecasted workforce. So we need to explore all explanations, all understanding of why things might be the way they are, so that we can make sure we've got people in place to do the work. Internal to the organization, we have to do a talent analysis. We've got to figure out, first of all, where the gaps are. Do we have a need for certain talent or skills? And do we have a means by which we can either train them in those skills or hire people with those skills? Obviously, the more novel the skills, the more difficult it is to find people with those skills, and we have to invest in doing training and development. But if it's a skill that's easily accessible, we may choose to hire people to fill those gaps. But the most important thing is we need to know what KSAOs our employees have, and we need to know what KSAOs we need, so we can start to see where there is a talent gap and then determine, does it make better sense to train or to hire? We next have to do a skills and job audit. So first of all, what jobs exist and how essential is that job? How many people are actually performing that job? Do we have 1 or 2 people, or do we have 15 or 20 or more? How does the reporting relationship work? Now, part of this is stuff that we should already know from our job analysis, which we will get into when we talk about selection systems and things like that, and job design. But we need to know, for the purpose of our internal audit, how do people relate to each other? If we want to set up a succession plan, we need to know what position they are moving from and what position they would be moving towards. So we need to know what the reporting relationships are, and then we need to know the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed to do that job. So will the nature of jobs change over time? So are we going to implement different jobs because there are future strategies that are going to require people to do something different, a new skill set, a new job category, whatever it might be? And again, what are the KSAOs that are needed for that particular anticipated job? So these are the types of things we need to think about in terms of what is the situation that we have right now, that people have certain skills right now, and what are they going to need into the future. We can also conduct an organizational capabilities inventory, where we go through our databases of skills that are required to do a particular job, as well as any additional trainings and certifications our employees had, so we have a good sense of what their capabilities are. And then we look at what are their demographics, what are their skill sets, what are their education levels, certifications, things like that. What is the career progression for each one of those employees? What do they anticipate wanting to do? Where do we anticipate placing them over time? Sort of that succession plan. And then what is their performance data? Are they performing the things well, or are they struggling with performance, which means that we need to do different kinds of interventions to make sure they have the skills they need to do those jobs. So the forecasting process, we have to break it down into the methods we will use to do the forecasting, which is the quantitative side of the things, and then how long of a period do we want to do it. Often organizations want shorter term, which is a year, intermediate term, which is anywhere from 2 to 3 years, and then long range plans, what we see ourselves potentially doing or anticipate doing 5 years or more down the road. Obviously, we have to pay close attention to the short and intermediate for the training skills that people need to do the job today, or at least within the immediate future. And the long-term plans are the career planning, the employee development plans, the things that we want to anticipate and be prepared for people to be able to do those jobs in the future. The methods we use can be best guess, which of course is not always the best option, but sometimes it's people's judgment that we rely on, usually for smaller businesses that don't have predictability in terms of their development. But most often we can use mathematical simulations or mathematical models, or a thing called a Markovian analysis, which I won't get into for the purpose of this class. A Markovian analysis is a more advanced analysis, but basically it's looking at inputs and outputs, which we will see in the last slide for this lecture series here. That kind of gets at some of the things that we should be looking at in terms of the flow of people in and out of an organization. So it basically breaks down into, judgment and expertise versus mathematical. I would recommend doing mathematical when you can, looking at longitudinal analysis, looking at trend analysis, things like that. You can use computer simulations to actually calculate those things, but sometimes your best guess is good as well. But I would depend less on that because, again, our decision-making abilities have flaws, and they can be biased. So be mindful of that, and you can come up with your best guess and then test it using a mathematical model and seeing how well you are at predicting things. So here's an example of some judgmental methods rather. You can do estimates. They can be top-down or bottom-up estimates, where we basically just ask people, how many people do you think you're going to need next year? I think I need one more, or I need 2 more, or I need 10 more, whatever that might be. Then we have a rule of thumb method, which basically relies on guidelines from other employees, one operations manager per 5 reporting supervisors, like ratios of some sort. So I know that if I have to have this much more work done, I need these many more supervisors and these many more employees to be able to meet those needs. And they're again guidelines, right? They're not anything typically detailed in orientation, but at least it gives us a sense of, we know the ratios of what we need to hire in order to meet needs. Then we can do what we call a Delphi technique, which is another type of decision-making method. And the experts come together and they make judgments based on their expertise and what they know about the facts going on around them. And then nominal group, again, same sort of idea, where the groups come together, they come up with different ideas, and then they compile the ideas into one report and make recommendations that way. Again, they're estimates, and they're not always completely reliable because people's memories can be biased, and they're not always going to be on top of the right numbers or have a good memory of what the numbers were, but at least it's a starting point, and it's better than nothing. Our mathematical models are obviously way more detailed and provide us with a lot more information. You could do regression analysis, which basically looks at what factors contribute what proportion to the outcome that you want. And so if we know that if sales increase by a certain percentage, we have to know the ratios and the numbers of employees we're going to need to be able to predict that. So statistical regression can do that. Simulation models, right, where we can set up a simulation through software that can run through different scenarios and figure out what the best option is. We could do what we call productivity ratios, calculating the average number of units produced per employee. So that goes back to those staffing ratios and production ratios that you could use your judgment on, but if we actually know what those hard numbers are, it makes it a lot easier to make those predictions. So we know for every unit of production we need 3 employees to create those units of production, then we know what we're going to need in the upcoming year if we want to up our productivity. And lastly, this gives you some of the way that the flow of things will come to the organization, inflows and outflows. And a Markovian analysis is based on this data. So knowing this data, even if you don't know how to do a Markovian analysis, is really important. So we have to look at our current staffing level. We have to know how many are going to leave versus how many are going to come to us and hired, and then we'll know what our internal supply will be for the upcoming year. So inflows are things like external hires for skills and abilities that we don't have in-house and we don't have the capacity to promote somebody from within. Or if we do promote them from within, what vacancy do they leave, and do we need to hire at the entry level for those positions if people are promoted out of them? So obviously we're always hiring at the entry level. We may not necessarily be hiring at the higher levels, but only if we are missing a particular skill set and no one is going to have the capacity or the ability to do the job for which we need to promote them to. There can be internal transfers, lateral transfers, as well as vertical transfers or promotions. Basically, a vertical transfer is really a promotion. People move up in the ladder. And then you can recall employees. Remember, we talked about layoffs and the turnover rates, and when people are laid off, we have the right to recall them. So there are some industries where there are seasonal layoffs and seasonal recalls. So in the construction industry, right, we might lay people off during the winter months, they collect unemployment, and then we hire them back once the market picks up and we have more jobs and availability for them. So this is the source of our inflows. And then the outflows are people who get promoted out of a position, people who leave voluntarily, people who are terminated for poor performance or for disciplinary reasons, demotions where we have somebody has not performed well in that position, so we demote them to a lower position. There's not usually a lot of that, but it can happen. Retirements, people who are leaving the workforce entirely, so they're retiring and they're leaving the company and leaving the work field. You can have people who die, right? I mean, particularly if you have older workers, you may be more likely to see people who are dying in your company before they retire or turn over. It could be a high risk, highly dangerous position, and there may be predictable deaths. Hopefully that would not be the case, but one never knows with certain companies, and it may be a factor you have to consider, that the more high risk a job is, the higher probability that someone may die from it. For example, working in a mine. A mine is considered one of the most dangerous jobs that one can have, in a coal mine. And so there are a certain percentage of deaths that one can expect from the job, unfortunately. Those are rare, but they can happen. Layoffs also. Are we letting people go because of seasonal fluctuations or demand fluctuations, in which case then we need to make sure that we are we have them ability as the recalls, right? So we might be laying them off, but then they become a source of inflow later as we recall them from the position. So these are all the basics that we need to consider for workforce planning. We need to be looking at inflows, outflows, making sure that we have the skills that we need, that we are figuring out ways to address the gaps between the skills we need and the skills we have.